We're now up to Daf Ayin Daled Amid Beis. Gas shel Even, if the wine press is made of stone, and stone is something called shiav, meaning it's very smooth and therefore it doesn't absorb that much. Shezafasa ove kochav, the idol worshiper coated this wine press, which is made of stone, with pitch, and then he applies, yayin nesech, forbidden wine, in the process, is menagva. All you need in order to allow use of the wine press for kosher wine is just to simply wipe it off with a dry towel. Vitahora, then any residue of yayin nesech was removed, and it's mutter. V'chachamim omrim yiklof es hazefes. After adding a coating of pitch, then there's more absorption. The stone itself would not absorb, but the pitch would absorb that zephes, and therefore you have to be kolef. And klipa means to take off like a kedei netilas etzba, because there is a certain element of blia. Again, even though there was nothing hot over here, but the cold substance would seep in to the pitch. The Chacham continue and they say v'shal cheres. Now cheres, which is earthenware, is more porous and absorbs. And therefore, afal pisha kolafes azefes, it's not sufficient if the earthenware utensil was covered with pitch, just to remove, the top layer of the pitch. That's not sufficient. But harezu asur, and this is an expression of the principle of that you cannot really remove successfully the absorbed wine or any ether that was absorbed through the pores of earthenware. There is one method, which we'll get to, Amir Hashem, not today, but that's called machlisin oso. You return it to the kivshan meaning to the place where you with tremendous heat you make the earthenware. So you sort of like recreate the earthenware, but otherwise it's us. Amar Rav. Rav says the following: that when do we require this niguv, as we saw in the case of a gatshel even in the Shita the Tanakama, that's dafka zefasa. That's only because the idolater coated the stone with pitch. Aval dorach ba lo. If he just used it for dricha, to stomp upon the grapes in order to remove the yayin, the grape juice, then there's no need to do niguv. And the reason for that is because dorach ba, all you need is rinsing, and that's sufficient to remove whatever residue there is of yayin nesach. So the Gemara asks Pshita, what did Rava? I mean, zafasa tnan. I mean, if there was no zafasa, then what are you left with? You didn't coat the wine with pitch, so you're left with stone. Obviously, you don't need any process. I mean, it'll air dry, let's say. And the Mishnah says zefasa, specifically making a condition of the requirement of niguv as the lowest level of hechsher is only because it was coated with pitch. It's Ma'odetema. If not for Rav, I would have said that huadina filu darach, but it's enough if the idol worshiper trods on the grapes, even if the wine press is made of stone and it's not coated with pitch, and that would be enough. I hide the katani zefasa. The Mishnah makes it contingent, the requirement of niguv contingent on the fact that he coated it with pitch. Urcha de Vilsa was mentioning a common situation, Kamash Malon. Therefore, Rav wants to tell us that as far as Niguv is concerned, that requirement only applies when it was coated with pitch. Ika di Amri. Now we have a second Lishna in Rava. Dafka Zafasa. When the Mishnah requires Niguv and drying, and that's enough for a stone wine press, that's only when he coated the wine press with pitch, and that's all he did. But if he went one step further, he tried upon the grapes in a pitch-coated wine press, lo sagile beniguv. That wouldn't be enough. The niguv is only sufficient if he got to the stage of coating the wine press with pitch, but not if he got to the next stage of being dorechba, because then it really seeps into the crevices of the pitch. Pshita. Again, I don't understand what Rava came to add zafasa tanan. The Mishnah implies that only that niguv is sufficient only because it reached the level of coating, but it didn't reach the level in which he had already tread the grapes in a pitch-coated wine press. I would have thought, if not for Rava, who I did afilu darachba. In truth, even in the latest stage where the idol worshiper trod upon the grapes in the wine press, even then it's sufficient to rely on niguv. It's only a common situation. Kamash Malan, Rava says, therefore, dafkas fasa. It's not enough to do niguv because he was already dorech on the grapes. So the Gemara goes on to tell us that we could support Rava from earlier Amoraim, Ki Ahudi also lekami de Reb Chia. Somebody came in front of Reb Chia, Omer lei, and he told Reb Chia, Hav li gavra, I need a person, didachi li matzarte. I need someone to kasher up my wine press. It's sort of like, a family of Bali Tshuva, they come to the Rav and they say, get me someone who could be machshir my entire kitchen. Amalei Rav. Now, Rav is the nephew of Reb Chia. So Reb Chia, the uncle, who got this request, appoints Rav and he says, Zil Bahadeh, I want you to accompany this man who owns a wine press. V'chazi delo mitzavcha alai bei midrash. Do such a good job that when you get back to the base medrash, no one's going to start screaming and crying against me with an outcry that, this is really not a sufficient hechsher. So do a good job. Make certain that the process is done properly. Because if you're not proper, then the wine is going to be usher, and then he's going to come to complain to me that my wine is usher. Also, Rav goes on his way. He saw that the coating of the wine press was very smooth, which means that there's a very limited amount of absorption, and therefore niguv should be sufficient. Omer, he declared, drying it with a dry cloth should be absolutely sufficient. There are no crevices, it's perfectly smooth, and that's all we need. However, he was on his way back from his initial inspection of the wine press, and now, he's looking again back at the wine press a second time to make sure that he's not messing things up and relying on niguv. Chaza pila mituse. All of a sudden, he sees that at the bottom of the wine press there's a crevice, and he sees that the crevice is filled with wine, and that wine is yain nesach. Omar, he declares, this wine press needs a lot more of a hechsher than just drying it off with a dry cloth. That wouldn't be sufficient, because look at all the wine that entered into the crevices. El Bekil, if you got to remove the entire coating. Chabibi means my uncle, meaning Reb Chia, that chazi delo mitzavches alai beit midrasha. Make sure that you don't give a kula, and then we'll find out that there's really yayin nesach there, and they'll cry out against me in the base measures. So Rava now came to the conclusion that drying is, I mean, we already saw this in Rava, that drying is insufficient as a machshir, and therefore we need kiluf, we need a more advanced stage, and now Rava is basically reflecting again that which we saw in Rav, and Rav required kiluf. Ton Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa, Gat v'amachatz v'amashpech. These are three different types of utensils that are all made of earthenware. Shal ovdei kochavim, and they are used in the context of a wine press. So we have number one, the gas itself, the wine press. Number two, we have something called a machatz, which in English is called a dipper. And when the juices were extracted from the grapes during the pressing, they gathered into a vat, drawn from the vat with a dipper, and poured through a funnel. And that's the third kli here, called a mashpech, which is a funnel. Is Rav mate beniguv, Rebbe mate beniguv, v'chachamim osrim. Rebbe says all you need here is niguv. Chacham say no. Niguv is not sufficient to be machshir, because there's a very high level of absorption in earthenware, as we said before, and drying is not sufficient, because earthenware is full of cracks and crevices, and therefore the yayin of Isur seeps in. Umoda Rebbe, but Rebbe will be machmir in the case of kankanim shel ovdei kochom shem asur. So now we're talking about jugs, earthenware jugs of the auto wash. Now, what's the difference between earthenware jugs on the one hand that Rav requires more than just niguv to be machshir them, whereas in the cases of Hagat machatz mamashpech, all he required was niguv. So the Gemara asks, ma hefresh bein zel is that? Zeh machniso l'kiyum, v'zeh machniso l'kiyum. Just 1 second. Right, the jug holds the wine for storage. V'zeh, but the other three kelim that we mentioned, ein machnisin l'kiyum. So the wine only goes through them, like through a funnel, or through the wine press, or perhaps through this dipper, only on a very temporary basis. So there's not enough time for real, serious, profound belia, and therefore they don't absorb the wine, and all you need to purify them is just drying them. Washing is not sufficient, because even though the wine is not stored there in the dipper, the wine press, and the funnel, but nevertheless it does remain in the wine press. And there's some slight minimum amount of absorption, which washing cannot remove, and therefore you need niguv. But utensils used to store wine are different. That's on a regular basis. And the Chachamim say that, well, first we'll start with Rebbe. Rebbe says that even in my humble opinion, when I was making it with niguv, but not in the case of utensils that are used to store. They're not merely for holding wine temporarily, but they're for long term. The Chacham say it makes no difference how the utensil is used. Even a new earthenware cup from which an idolater drank becomes forbidden, cannot be purified by niguv. Bishal eitz, the Brisa says, if the utensils are made of wood, bishal even, or of stone, yanagiv, then all you need is to dry them. Because in these cases, both Rebbe and the Chacham agree, and there's no dispute that there's no absorption. However, if they were coated with pitch, then they are forbidden. Unless, of course, you remove all the pitch. I mean, Frekti Gemara, there is a contradiction over here. Tonight we learned in that Mishnah, Gas shel Evan shezifsasa v'nagva v'hitahora. So the Mishnah says that if you dry, that's enough for a pitch coat stone press, according to all the opinions. The Brisa says that drying does not suffice for pitch coated stone wine press, according to all the opinions. And the Gemara answers, Masnisin de lo darch, but Bryce of the darch. The Mishnah is talking about a case where the idol worshiper did not tread on the grapes in the winepress, whereas the Bryce is talking about a case where he did tread on the grapes. And therefore, since the pressure of the treading can create crevices in the pitch where the wine gathers together, it's necessary to remove the pitch coating even from a stone wine press, according to Chachamim, and certainly from a wooden wine press. Now, although the dipper and the funnel were not subject to treading, since they're left in the wine and used extensively with it, the rabbis were more machmir with them and required the same level of tara, of hechsher, as they do for a wine press. Omar Ma, we saw in the Brisa that Agat v'Machas v'Mashpech Shalovi Kolchom Rebbe Mater Benigu v'Chacham Osum. So the Gemara asks, wait a second, let's take a look at what Rebbe says in the following Brisa and compare it to the Mishnah. V'Anan Tnan Shel Cheres Afal Pisha Kolofes Hazefes Harei Zu Asura. So the Mishnah doesn't have any machlokas here. It's a stam Mishnah. It would seem that even Rebbe would agree that in the case of earthenware, a wine press that's made out of cheres cannot be purified by just removing its pitch, because the yayin nesach seeps even below the pitch, and even if it was dry. Whereas Rebbe in the Brisa says that if it's an uncoated earthenware wine press, you can purify it through drying. The last section in the Mishnah is reflecting the sheet of the Rabbana. It's not a, shall we say, l'divrei hakol, it's not a unanimous opinion, meaning it's only according to the opinion of some of the Chachamim, but not of all the Chachamim. So therefore, according to Rebbe, the removal of the coating of the pitch, followed by drying, suffices for an earthenware wine press, and he's very consistent with his view in the Brisa that drying is sufficient for an uncoated wine press. And when you remove the coating of the pitch and then you dry it, that's equal to an uncoated wine press where drying suffices. Dorash Rava Nava Artechu. Okay, so now we're getting into what's called Hagola, which means purifying the wine press by scalding it with boiling water. And Rava's Hagola pertains to a pitch-coated wood or stone wine press that he bought from an idolater. And the removing of the coating is very time-consuming and complicated of a process. Therefore, Rava presents an alternative to allow for immediate use of the wine press. He doesn't limit the ruling to wine presses known to have been tried on by idolater. Rather, even a wine press not known to have been tried by idolater should be scalded because of the concern that the idolater might have treaded, as we saw in the instance with Reb Chia. Rava ki hava mishader gufe laharban. When Rava would send empty jugs with the idol worshiper to Arpanya, a country, I guess, Sachif luhu afumayu, he would place them in stacks with the mouth of the jugs facing down. V'chasim luhu abir tzayhu, and then he would place a seal over the bottom side, because Sovri holds kol davar shemachniso lekiyum, any utensil which is used to hold wine on a long-term basis for storage, even if it was only left in the possession of the idolater on a temporary basis, nevertheless the Rabbanan decreed that it's forbidden for use. So this Zara was instituted to prevent people from leaving such containers with an idolater for extended periods of time, which would cause them to become forbidden, even if the idolater stored wine in them for a short period of time. But if he would store it for an extended period of time, certainly it would be us. So the Rabbanan therefore made a decree that containers, like wine, containers become forbidden by being left even temporarily in the idolater's possession. Kama min Agvan, Rav Omer b'mayim, and Rabbi Bar Bachon Omer b'efer. So what substance do you use to dry the winemaker's equipment? Rav says it's got to be with water, and Rabbi Bar Chana says it's got to be with ash. And the Gemara analyzes. Rav Omer b'mayim v'lo b'efer? Only with water and not ash? Could it really be? Can cleansing be accomplished with ash alone without water? And therefore, Rabbi Bar Chana Omer b'efer, he has to use ash. In fact, the Gemara b'efer v'lo b'mayim, is ash enough to cleanse and purify these utensils? Can you accomplish the cleansing with ash alone? Ella. But rather the positions of Rav and Rabbi Chana should be understood. Here we turn to Ayin Hey. Rav Amar b'mayim v'uadin li'efer, but he has to add efer. Rabbi Chana Amar li'efer v'uadin b'mayim, and therefore there's no machlokas between the two. They're only each referring respectively to the initial stage of the process. And there is no machlokas. Ha beritva v'ha bi'abeshta. So Rabbi Bar Chana is ruling about the ash, which came before the water. That pertains to a moist winepress, while the ruling of Rav, that the water precedes the ash, that pertains to a dry winepress. So if moisture from the prohibited wine remains, the winepress is first to be scoured with ash until it's dry, and then to be washed. Okay, then, so this is where we'll stop on the top of Daf Ayin Hey.